When you look at the wrists of some of the greatest explorers of the last, say, 100 years or so, you most likely will find a watch on the wrist. And in this video, we're going to be doing that, but looking at some really out-of-this-world watches. Oh, that was a juicy pun. Because we are going to be looking at watches that went to space and the moon. Let's get into it. Now, I think there is potential to do a part 2 of this series, so if you do want me to do it, let me know. Leave a like, also leave a comment. So when you think of chronographs that went to space, you're probably not thinking Bulova lunar pilot, but you should, as it is one of the most impactful watches when we think about space exploration. The year was 1971, and David Scott, one of the astronauts aboard the Apollo 15 mission, the 4th mission to land men on the moon, brought along his personal Bulova lunar pilot, despite the entire crew being given Omega Speedmasters that were issued by NASA. During their expedition, Scott underwent multiple excursions on the moon. It was reported during his second walk on the moon's surface, the crystal of his Omega Speedmaster popped off. With being without a watch, once he got back and was ready for his 3rd excursion, he decided to be accompanied by his personal Bulova lunar pilot. And unlike his Speedmaster, his Bulova survived the mission and made it back safely to Earth just like the rest of the crew. But what makes this watch so unique is because it was privately owned by Scott. Since Omega Speedmasters were issued by NASA, it made them property of the US government, making it impossible for them to ever be put up for private auction. So when in 2015 it was reported that the watch was to be put up for auction, there was a lot of hype. And the price tag of the watch and what it was able to obtain at auction falls in line with what you would expect from a watch that was hyped up significantly, coming in with a closing auction price of $1.6 million. This made it the most expensive astronaut-owned artifact ever sold at auction, while also making it a worthy highlight for our video today. And the cool thing about Bulova lunar pilots is they are pretty much unchanged for the most part in terms of their aesthetics. They look very similar. You can pick one up for a few $100, and they're awesome watches. They have a coarse movement in them, but it's a high-performance coarse movement. We're talking accuracy up to plus or minus 10 seconds a year. So really interesting watches. I think they have a great aesthetic, and maybe you don't have the money to throw at an Omega Speedmaster. Really cool watches to look at. So now for our next watch, we first have to look at another watch because there's a little bit of confusion that came along in this story. It starts back in 1985 when German astronaut Reinhard Furr wore a Sinn 140-142 aboard the Spacelab D1 mission. And at the time, it was recognized as the first automatic chronograph ever taken into space. The mystique around the piece only was increased by the fact that this was the last successful mission of the Challenger space shuttle before its tragic explosion on January 28, 1986. However, back in 2007, an avid watch collector took a look at a picture from the Skylab 4 mission, particularly William Pogue, an astronaut on the mission. The year of that mission was 1973, leading to a little speculation that we might need to restructure popular belief regarding what first automatic chronograph was the first to go into space. Dave Bruno, the watch enthusiast who spotted the photo, sent a letter to Pogue where he sought out the clarification of the watch he brought to space and noticed in the photo. The speculated watch, a Seiko 6139-6002. Pogue responded with a handwritten note on the letter and confirmed the watch in question by stating that he used the bezel of the watch to time engine burns during the mission. At the time of Skylab 4, Omega Speedmasters were issued to be given to NASA astronauts. However, during training, Pogue used his Seiko 6139, and he really grew a familiarity with it. And despite not getting permission to bring it on board, he brought it on board, and in very similar fashion to how maybe you or I would bring a candy bar into the movie theater. Just snuck it in his pocket. As you would imagine, these Seiko watches have went up in price. You can still find them out there, and now are formally known as Seiko Pogues. But if you do want to get one, just be careful, as there are a lot of restructured Franken Seiko watches out there. So just be careful. I can leave a link to a helpful forum that has essentially a buyer's guide for those that might be interested in hunting one of these down. Now for our last 2 watches, I want to highlight 2 world powers that were going head to head. And when you think of space travel, you think of the USSR in the United States of America. To start us off, we head to the date of March 18th to look at USSR's mission, Voskhod 2. This was the most ambitious space mission to date, featuring a 2-person crew and included design changes with the addition of an inflatable airlock to allow the attempt for the first airwalk in space, a feat that had yet to be accomplished by man. Alexei Leonov, the astronaut set to make the attempt, was accompanied by a watch on his journey, a Russian chronograph, a Polzhat Strela. His particular model, featuring a caliber 3107 Strela, was issued to all Soviet Air Force and astronauts from 1959 all the way to 1979. Leonov's model had a white dial with gold-colored hands and indices, with 2 symmetrical subdials that came in with a 37mm case. Leonov made his attempt of the first spacewalk in the history of mankind with this watch on his wrist, and ultimately he was successful. Well, kind of. There was a lot of complications, and by complications, I'm not talking about the watch. During his spacewalk, Leonov's spacesuit expanded as a result of the vacuum of space and made it impossible for him to re-enter the narrow spacecraft airlock, which led to him manually having to depressurize his suit to be able to enter. This delay in his re-entry led to the cabin to fill with dangerously high levels of pure oxygen, which needed to be balanced at a more sustainable level before re-entry. Otherwise, the smallest spark of any kind could lead to deadly consequences. The re-entry procedure ended up taking 46 seconds longer for the 2 men to return to their seats in order for the spacecraft's center of mass to be regulated, which led the aircraft to actually overshoot its target landing spot by over 200 miles in the middle of the woods, where the 2 astronauts had to fend off hungry wolves and bears in the woods and had very little supplies, no food, and had to wait for a rescue crew to come. But despite the complications, it was ultimately a success because they did make it back and were able to live, as Leonov is still alive to this day. The cool thing about this is vintage Strellas can still be found on the market for decent prices, even some coming sub $1,000. But the coolest part about this is the fact that you can still get one of these watches new, as the company still produces them to this day, and it's a watch that I've actually mentioned on the channel before. So if you're looking for a Russian chronograph, still a really good choice to this day. And now for our last watch, we have the OG when it comes to watches on the moon, the Omega Speedmaster. Back in 1957, Omega made history with releasing 3 very iconic watches, known as their professional collection. It consisted of the Omega Speedmaster 300, a watch for divers and those involved in marine activity, the underappreciated Railmaster, a watch with high anti-magnetic properties and a tool for engineers, and then finally some random little chronograph you might have heard of, the Omega Speedmaster, which was intended to be a sports racing chronograph at the time of its conception. And space travel was really not on the list of things that it was aimed to be made to do. That was until 1962, when NASA astronaut Wally Schirra got aboard a Project Mercury flight, Sigma 7, and decided to wear his personal Omega Speedmaster CK2998 on board. Following the success of the mission, Schirra and his fellow astronaut Gordon Cooper began mentioning to NASA about the desire to have a certified watch during missions. And in 1964, with the space race in full effect, NASA decided it was time to start looking for watches to feature on the wrists of their astronauts to assist in their expeditions to space. Several brands like Rolex, Longines, and Wittenauer, as the 2 brands were held under the same umbrella back in the day, Hamilton and Omega submitted watches to undergo intensive testing by NASA. The testing process took 5 months and included 11 different tests. Some that included temperature testing at temperatures of 200 degrees Fahrenheit for time periods of 30 minutes at a time, acceleration G-force tests starting with 1G and working up to 7.25G in all different directions, and then shock tests of short bursts of up to 40Gs, and several other tests as well. In short, to pass these tests, this had to be a very well-constructed watch. Following the 5 months of testing, you can probably guess the winner, the Omega Speedmaster. Speedmasters were used throughout the Apollo program. However, let's fast forward to when this watch truly became a legend with the Apollo 11 mission. The year was 1969, and the world watched in amazement as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took their first steps on the moon. It is reported that they wore a reference ST105012 on the moon, 42 millimeters, and a legendary caliber 321. It is reported that Neil Armstrong left his watch back in the lunar module. However, Buzz Aldrin elected to wear his as he was navigating the moon's surface. Because these Omega watches were issued by NASA, they are technically property of the US government. So upon their return to Earth, the watch was sent to the Smithsonian Institution. But the watch somehow was lost and misplaced during shipment. So the current whereabouts of Buzz Aldrin's piece is actually unknown. But just to play some fun, imagine if this piece was found in some hypothetical situation, you could sell it. What do you think the price of that watch would be? That would be pretty interesting. I'd love to see comments about what your guesses would be. In short, the Omega Speedmaster, one of the most iconic watches of all time, and I don't think there should be any dispute why it gets so much hype that it does. All right, guys, so that's our video here today. If you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well. That's a huge help for the channel. Another big help, and also another great way to get the most out of your watch is going over to our website, checking out our watch straps. I put those watch straps up against any others in the industry. So if you go there, purchase one, it's a big way to help the channel. Probably the best way to help the channel outside of watching the content. And then finally, if you want to be entered to win our watch giveaway, just fill out the watch giveaway form form. You only need to do it once. If you've already done it, you're good, but also be following me on Instagram as well to be eligible to win upcoming giveaways. And guys, thanks again so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.